Ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to Season 3 premiere, Episode 32, Down on the Corner, the flagship show of KINER'S. I'm your host, Mark Rosenman, and we're thrilled to kick off another season celebrating the game we absolutely love. Tonight's episode is extra special because our guest has a direct connection to the very name of our website, the man we pay homage to, Ralph Kiner. Joining us tonight is Scott Kiner, son of the Hall of Famer, Mets broadcasting legend and inspiration behind KINER'S. Scott grew up in a baseball world like no other, spending his childhood at Shea Stadium watching his father in the Mets booth. But he didn't just live in the shadow of greatness. He carved out his own remarkable career in sports broadcasting as well, media management and marketing, from working as a sports reporter in the late 70s to helping launch the careers of names like Jimmy Kimmel and Carson Daly. Scott's journey is filled with incredible stories and experiences, and we're going to get into those tonight. We'll talk about his upbringing, his career, and of course, his father's legacy, one that still resonates deeply with Met fans and this very show. So for those of you who are new to our Zoom room, just a quick reminder. I'll start off the show with a couple of questions to our guest. We ask during that time you keep yourself muted, and then we'll turn it over to you guys because you guys always ask better questions than I. You guys will use the raise hand feature, and for those guys that are not technically savvy, you can just do that, and I'll acknowledge you, and then we'll get your questions in. So, Scott, if I'm correct, you were born the last year of your dad's playing career. At what age were you aware of how great your father was as a ball player?
I would say probably about the time he started broadcasting with the White Sox. Actually, he did a year with the White Sox in 1961. And by that time, I was really starting to realize that I was somewhat of a lucky spermer, that I was born into a pretty amazing life. And but it took me a while. I mean, of course, the last year he played was with Cleveland in 1955. I was just a baby. And then he went into the Pacific Coast League as the general manager of the San Diego Padres, which he did for about 5 years. And actually, he had an opportunity with Hank Greenberg and with Bill Veeck and C. Arnold Smith, who was the owner of the Padres, to acquire the expansion team in Los Angeles, in that wound up being the Los Angeles Angels. And what happened was, at that particular time, of course, I wasn't aware of it, was that Walter O'Malley with the Dodgers didn't want anybody to be anywhere near his golden market of Los Angeles. So he put a stipulation that the expansion team in LA had to be at least 25 miles away from his new baseball stadium at Dodger Stadium. And that kind of killed their thought that they were going to open this new franchise in the Coliseum in Los Angeles. And what happened was they dropped their bid because the bid required that Veeck and Greenberg sell the White Sox in order to acquire the Angels in Los Angeles. So they backed away from the deal, but they had already made a deal with Gene Autry to broadcast the games. And O'Malley went to Autry and said, "You're already in this deal, so why wouldn't you pick it up?" And he did, and that's how the Singing Cowboy became a franchise owner in Major League Baseball. And right after that, my dad went to work for the White Sox, and about that time, I became much more aware of who he was because he was broadcasting. That was the start of his broadcasting career, and then of course, right after that first season, he got a call from George Weiss of the Mets, the expansion Mets, and asked my dad if he would like to join Bob Murphy and Lindsey Nelson in the booth for the new team in New York. And my dad asked him, "Why do you want me to join the team?" And Weiss said, "Well, because we know you have a lot of experience with losing, and we're going to be really, really bad. So we thought you'd be the great addition to the team." And my dad went to Hank and said, "What do you think I should take the job?" And Greenberg said, "You'd be nuts not to take the job in New York." And then, of course, he went to become the voice of the Mets in 1962. And by that time, I was very much aware of my dad's celebrity, so to speak.
That's so interesting. So you're at an age then obviously that you're able to comprehend baseball and everything that comes with it. Did you get to actually see your dad on the set of Kiner's Corner, and what is your most vivid memory of watching that show live as your dad's doing it?
I did. I remember as a kid in 1962, KINER'S Corner opened in the underbelly of the Polo Grounds, and of course the Polo Grounds was a very very old stadium, and I remember my dad starting that show, and it was very very archaic at the time. And if you're an avid follower of my father, you know that his first show he had the great Casey Stengel on, and uh, and Casey was a great interview because you never had to. He never gave you a yes or no answer. You had to shut him up. He'd go into his Stinglese, which was just amazing. Casey was the right guy for the job to be the general manager of this new team. Anyway, so at the end of the first KINER'S Corner, they go to break to commercial, and Casey gets up to walk off the set to go back to the clubhouse, and he forgets he has a wired mic on. And as he gets up to leave, he pulls down the entire set. So that was an auspicious occasion for the first KINER'S Corner. But KINER'S Corner was. I remember I saw when I was in the ballpark, and when I was in the ballpark, I was always obviously there with my dad, so I wasn't leaving if he wasn't leaving. So I watched a lot of the games off camera, a lot of the shows off camera, and really enjoyed it very, 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 very much, very much.
Was there ever a time, I mean, obviously you're around the ballpark at Shea Stadium with your dad as a young kid, getting to see all the stars of the National League. Was there one player in particular that you got to meet that stood out to you?
Um, well, I was always a big Tom Seaver fan, and who wouldn't be? I mean, he was the franchise. But in the early days, you know, I used to root for players, all kinds of different players, and unfortunately, in the early years, there wasn't a lot to root for. But but Tom was my favorite. I was Tom came along a little bit later. I think he broke in '67, um, and uh, and he was maybe what 19, 20 years of age, and I was probably like 8. So he always treated me like a little brother. So I always liked Tom. I loved Crane Pool. Ed was just such a nice guy, and most of the Mets were all really really nice guys, but some of them were just up for a cup of coffee, if you know what I mean, and they were coming and going, and there was never a dull moment.
It's also interesting to me if you think about it. Obviously now with the Mets booth with Gary Cohn and Ron Darling and Keith Hernandez, Ron Darling and Keith Hernandez have that connection because they played for the New York Mets. Your dad never played for the Mets. You just relayed the story about how he actually got the job because he's used to losing. You take a look at how ingrained your dad is into the DNA of Met fans. And we see it on a daily basis in our KINER'S group, and the love, the outpouring, and just reverence that your dad is held in this New York area. Did he ever speak about how strange? I mean, I would venture to guess, maybe I'm wrong because of New York bias, but I would venture to guess that he's as much loved in this New York market, maybe even more so than he is in Pittsburgh. Did he ever talk about that?
Well, he really loved Pittsburgh. I mean, uh, for a young man who came out of World War II and really had nothing to go to Pittsburgh for just over 7 years, and be idolized the way he was because of what he did. I mean, um, he was such a superstar at such a young age. Behind pitchers feared to see him at the plate. He was such a great threat, playing on some of the worst teams. Um, so, um, you know, To answer your question, it's really hard to say where he's more loved, if that's kind of what your question is. Where is he more loved, or where did he love it the most? He truly loved the time he spent in Pittsburgh, but and as I think I mentioned to you when we talked previously, I frequently asked him, or I asked him one time very sincerely, I said, Dad, what would you consider your greatest accomplishment? Your time playing baseball or your time broadcasting baseball? And he said his time playing baseball. However, he only played baseball for 10 years,
Yes.
and he broadcast for 50. So he just loved baseball so much. It's hard to imagine anybody who could spend 70 years uh, involved in baseball. I mean, think of this routine. You go to spring training, whether you're a player or an announcer, in February, late February, and then your opening day is about April 1st, and you spend the next 6 months, 162 games, broadcasting, and pretty much after the season's over, you have a 3.5 month break, and follow that same routine for 70 years. It's pretty amazing, but that also points out that he truly loved the game of baseball, and I can't
Oh,
think of anybody who has that type of I don't want to say a resume, because to him it wasn't work. It wasn't a resume. It was just his DNA. He loved baseball.
Absolutely, and it came through on every single broadcast, and thankfully, I mean, he lived to an older age, and you got to see him get so many awards. You got to see the most prestigious of them all, getting into the Hall of Fame in 1975, which was interesting because he garnered 273 votes that time, which was one more than the minimum needed for election. It was actually in his final year of eligibility, which I always boggles my mind how
Well,
someone
I
who's
think I have Mark, let me explain to you why that happened, because I've thought about it for a long time. The reason why that happened was there were several reasons why it happened. Number one, the minimum was 10 years, and he played 10 years. And a lot of sports writers felt that longevity was a consideration for inductment and being inducted into the Hall of Fame. Another reason was because he never played in a playoff game his entire life. You know, you know this because, and true Met fans know this. To give you some perspective, I mean, my dad never played in a playoff game. And now I'm going to switch gears here. Nolan Ryan in '69 pitched 3 innings in relief in the '69 World Series, and that was the only time he ever appeared in the World Series. And he had like a 20-year career. So my dad never appeared in a playoff game. He played the minimum, and part of that's due to World War II. And the other thing was that he played in Pittsburgh, and Pittsburgh was a small market. And even in Pittsburgh, when he was playing, when in the height of his career, they drew 1.5 million people in Pittsburgh, which was in 1948 was the highest grossing, the highest attendance in all of major leagues. So even though he was in a small market, and the reason why he was the highest paid player in the National League was because people came to watch him play. And if when you get the accolades that he received, and you wind up on the box of Wheaties, there's a reason why people are coming out to the ballpark.
absolutely.
So yes,
You
go
know,
ahead, Mark.
I think, I think it must have meant something extra to him because I don't know, we can talk about Cal Ripken streak, but I believe that your dad had gone to ever since he was elected. I think he's been to every single induction ceremony up until the time of his death. So I think he really cherished that Hall of Fame election. What did he talk about when, he talked about the Hall of Fame and him being in it?
I'm really surprised that you know that stat. He was so honored to be in the Hall of Fame that unlike some players, and I'm not saying this in a negative way.
Hmm.
For example, Hank Aaron rarely would go back after he was inducted. My father was so honored to be inducted. He felt it was being a member of a very, very prestigious organization that he would make sure that he'd go back and recognize the new inductee every year. And he did go back every year. And It meant everything to him. He said that in his acceptance speech, he said having that HOF after your name is like being a doctor and having PhD after your name.
Nice.
So yes, he really it meant everything to him. Yes.
It's kind of strange. I mean, obviously, he's not my father, but Ralph Kiner to so many of us younger kids growing up was like that father. We related to him. What was he like as a father outside of the baseball? And did you guys have any special traditions or favorite activities you did outside of baseball? Because obviously his time was very limited. Because, like you said, February to some of those early years, the Mets were done early. But later on, we had playoffs and such. But what was your time away from baseball like with your dad?
Well, obviously, my dad was a golf fanatic. I mean, he was into golf. He loved golf. I mean, I remember one time he moved from one house to another house, and I was helping him move, and I think he had like a dozen set of clubs. I mean, if you came up with a new invention in golf, he would buy it. And matter of fact, one time I was playing golf with him, and he had this new driver, and it had a titanium shaft. And I said, Dad, that driver looks really, really kind of cool. Tell me about it. He said, this is a titanium shaft. It was a gift from Nelson Doubleday. And I said, God, that looks really good. And I hit the driver and I said, God, that thing really works great. He said, but you can't have one. I said, what do you mean I can't have one? He said, you can't have one. I said, why? He said, because it's $1,500. And I said, oh, you're right. I can have one. So uh, golf, we spent a lot of time on the golf course. My dad was obviously a golf fanatic. My mother once said, thank God golf courses don't have lights, or your dad would never come home. So uh, golf was we were great golf pals, and I had 2 hole-in-ones with him, and when I made the second one, because he only had one in his lifetime, he looked at me and he said, almost forlorn, he said, "Now you have twice as many as I have." And I said, "Dad, you're not that competitive, really."
Oh, that's awesome.
But anyway,
So
he was he very conservative father, very conservative, and he he, uh, he very conservative. For example, I'll give you an example. You do not talk about Pete Rose at the dinner table. We're not going there. He broke the rules. I'm sorry, he broke the rules. And that was just my dad. He was a very, very conservative man, and he believed in hard work. He believed, obviously, he worked all of his life, and he believed in instilling that work ethic in his children, like myself.
it's amazing because your father is a larger than life figure, but your mother also is a tennis champion, a trailblazer in her own right. Um, how did her career influence you? And we're talking about the great Nancy Chaffee, obviously.
Yeah. Well, my mother, you know, it's very, and I know this obviously because I'm a child. My mother, that was two alpha personalities colliding, and I'm the result of that collision. But my mother was just a dynamo, glamour girl in her own right. She played in the late 40s, early 50s, about the same time. And my dad and mom married in 1951. And my dad and my mom were on magazine covers, and national magazine covers, and they were the talk of the country when they married, and their wedding was very, very big event. And but my mom was also very much a dynamo, and they just had a storybook life together, and until it kind of fell apart. But my mother was she was fourth in the world in tennis. She and then after her tennis career, she also went into broadcasting. She was on the broadcasting team of the Battle of the Sexes, which was Billie Jean King and Bobby Riggs. And of course, that's still today the most watched tennis match ever on television. And you know, before the match, my mother said to Billie Jean, "If you don't beat him, I'm going to come out of retirement and do it myself." But she did beat him, so.
So you start as a sports reporter in the late 70s. Did your father have any influence over your decision to go into broadcasting? And was there any advice that he gave you that stuck with you?
Uh, I think I felt very natural about going into broadcasting because I sat in KINER'S corner as a child, and I also obviously was that was just part of the family, um, and it seemed very natural for me to do. After I figured out that I wasn't going to make a living as a competitive tennis player, I decided I better get a real job, and I went into radio, local radio in Palm Springs, California. And one day I get a phone call from CBS, ABC network radio in New York, asking me if I will cover the Davis Cup final at Mission Hills in that particular year. And I said, yeah, I'd love to do it. And they said, okay, you're hired. And I became a West Coast stringer for even people like Win Elliott out of New York. I was working with him and others and Mutual Radio. And I had a lot of fun in the sense that, I was ringside for Larry Holmes, his title defense against Cooney. And, I was in Vegas all the time for the boxing and I was covering baseball and PGA golf on the West Coast for quite a while. And that was a lot of fun. And then I got married and started having children and decided I needed to find something else to do. And which was I went into radio management and ran a station in Palm Springs. So yeah, my dad of my brother and my sister and myself, I'm the only one that really went into broadcasting. I mean, my brother's an architect, and my sister was married and never really had an interest in sports or broadcasting. But I'm of the three children, I'm the one that has actually had his most of his life in broadcasting, like my father.
It's also interesting because your stepfather is also very well known in media, Jack Whitaker, a legendary broadcaster. How did he shape your perspective on media and storytelling?
My gosh, Jack is just a icon. Uh, to give you some perspective, when Jim Nance was coming up, my stepfather Jack Whitaker at that point was basically um, the man. For those of your viewers out there that can remember, Jack Whitaker he actually broadcast the first Super Bowl. So I mean, but he was really known as an essayist. He was an essayist. He would come on and after the event and reflect on what you just saw in a very elegant and poetic way. And as an essayist, Jim Nance said the first time I met Jack Whitaker was at the Del Monte Lodge clubhouse, and he was sitting at the bar with a martini. And I walked up to him, and I felt like I was meeting Ernest Hemingway for the first time. And Jack was so talented and so well spoken. I am blessed to have had him in my life. He married my mother, so that everybody understands that my mother and my father divorced when I was about 14 years of age, 13, 14 years of age. My mother never remarried for 22 years, and then she married Jack Whitaker. And Jack and they had a very happy life together until she passed away. But Jack was just it's so amazing, and what a wonderful addition to the family. And he and I spent quite a bit of time together. So I was very close to Jack, and he is obviously in the Sportscasting Hall of Fame,
Yeah.
and he was just one of a kind guy. And my dad and Jack were really good friends. So that was, and Jack used to listen to my dad call Mets games, and he was a Met fan, so it was kind of cool.
That's awesome. All right, before we turn it over to the Zoom room, I have one more question for you. We spoke about your role in your field in media, launching the careers of people like Jimmy Kimmel and Carson Daly. Can you share some stories about working with them and what you saw what you saw about them that you thought that there's something there early on?
Well, it's funny. Jimmy actually, when he worked for me, he was on the air as Chris Kimmel. He didn't use his real first name, and it was like I kept wondering: is somebody trying to find you? Are you hiding from somebody? And anyway, he was just a a punk broadcaster I found in Las Vegas. I needed a morning man, and he was really hungry. He wanted a job, and he came in and interviewed with me. And I said, "Okay, I'll give you a break. I'll give you an opportunity." And I put him on in the morning, and he. I'm complimenting Jimmy. I never had to worry about his show prep. He was all he when he got off the air, he'd start working on a show for the next day. The guy was really talented, and he had an off the wall comedy about him. And then Carson Daly's mother came and saw me one day and said, "I want you to give my kid a job." And he was like an 18-year-old kid as a freshman at College of the Desert. And she said, "Well, he'll intern." And I said, "Intern? That means free." And so I said, "Yeah, I'll give him a job." And I asked Jimmy to come to my office. I said, I'm thinking about putting this kid on, putting him on your show in the morning." He said, "Yeah, I'll take him. I'll torture him." And they had a really great morning show where Jimmy tortured Carson. And I remember one gag they did in the morning. Jimmy sent Carson down to the corner of Highway 111 and Fred Waring Drive. Fred Waring, of course, the old entertainer in Fred Waring in Pennsylvania. That's what the street was named after. Anyway, he's standing on the corner of this major intersection in the desert, and the contest was first person who calls me in to tell me what Fred's wearing wins a prize. And what he did was he sent Carson down to the corner in cowboy boots, boxer shorts, and a cowboy hat. And it didn't take long for him to get a phone call from somebody who won the prize. But that's the way he kind of tortured Carson Daly. And of course, Carson went on to become of many, besides Good Morning America or the Today Show, I should say, and The Voice and the other things that he's done. And Jimmy, of course, you can watch him tonight at late night as Jimmy Kimmel Live. So they were really fun to work with, and it just I feel really thankful that I was able to give them both a hand up.
Would have loved to hear some of the tapes of that morning show. That sounds pretty wild. All right, so now for those of you who are new to the show, we turn it over to the Zoom room. We ask that you use the raise hand function, or you do it old school, like I see Steve already doing. I pretty much know our audience pretty well, but I always like to say it anyway. We want you to keep all your questions respectful, because that's what we do here. So my portion of the Q&A is over. So Stevie, I'm going to ask you to unmute and you can get the first question.
So glad to be back for a new season. Thank you, Mark. Scott, so nice to meet you. Me amongst this group, I'm sort of the young generation X, being born in 70. But your dad was really a formative part of me becoming a Mets fan, because sitting on my dad's lap in the 70s and turning the dial for him to watch KINER'S Korner, it was a big deal, because I was sort of glued to that and to your dad's commentary and to your dad's interviews, and so that was a lot of fun. He always seemed to come out with really funny quotes, as much as Yogi Berra did. One of them I remember, if Casey Stengel was alive today, he'd be spinning in his grave. And I don't even remember the context of it. I just remember laughing at that. Do you
Yeah.
Do you know what was the context of that quote?
Well, I guess it was obviously a very, very bad play by Mets, and back in the day, that was not uncommon. If you'll remember, the first play in the history of the franchise was a ground ball to Zimmer at third, and he threw the ball to first baseman Gil Hodges over his head and into the stands. So, I mean, that's the kind of thing that would make my father say if Casey was alive today. But Casey was alive for that. But, I mean, that kind of thing would probably prompt him to make that kind of comment. You know, I mean, my dad really, to expand on that a little bit, my dad was, when he was announcing for the White Sox in 1961, he said during a broadcast, my dad really wanted to be erudite. He didn't want to be like Dizzy Dean. He slid in the second. He didn't really want to be that kind of a broadcaster. He wanted to be an intelligent, true broadcaster. But he said during a broadcast, he said, Luis Aparicio is the most ubiquitous shortstop in the American League. To which, after the game, Bill Veeck came up to my father and said, Ralph, if you ever use the word ubiquitous on the air again, you will not be broadcasting for the White Sox. And you know, of course, he didn't use it the way it was meant to be used, but the point was, you need to talk to the common man. And though my dad had, you know, I asked my dad, I said, you know, does it upset you about all the times people have talked about the mistakes you've made? And he said, no, it doesn't really bother me. And he said, Scott, it's not that easy sometimes to be calling a broadcast and have a producer in your ear with your headphones on. You can get distracted. And I had the opportunity to actually broadcast an inning when I back in 34 years ago. I had it when I was younger. They asked me if I would do an inning in San Diego in September, and both the Padres and the Mets were out of the race. And it's like, nobody's really watching. Who really cares? Let Scott call an inning. So I actually got a chance to call an inning, and it was late in the game. It was like seventh inning, eighth inning. So I actually started off the inning and say, and I basically said, oh, the score is like 4-3. Mets coming up for the Mets is so-and-so and so-and-so. And then in my headphone, I hear the producer say, Scott, the Padres have made 3 defensive changes. You need to bring that up. And I'm going like, what? And I haven't been keeping score. I don't have anybody next to me to tell me what's going on. You know, it's not as easy as you think it is to broadcast a ball game, and it's easy to be distracted. So, you know, my dad said things like the Hall of Fame inductions this year will be on July 32nd and 33rd. And you go like, well, he obviously knows there isn't a July 32nd and 33rd, but he said that. Or all of their road wins and come on the road, or he says things like that. But it didn't seem to bother him, and I think it actually ingratiated him to the Mets fan, because when he made a mistake, it was as if, well, the Mets make mistakes every game, so that's part of the Met mystique.
Absolutely.
And as an aside, you mentioned Jimmy Kimmel, and I have a connection to Jimmy Kimmel in that I graduated with Sal Iacano from John Glenn High School in Elwood, New York. And of course, they've been sort of a writing duo for, God, the past 30 or 40 years. 30 years, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. The Man Show is back 30 years ago. Wow, that's crazy. Mm-hmm. All right.
Yeah, it is crazy.
Yeah. So I see a newcomer to the show this year. It's Damon. So I'm going to ask you to unmute, and you're up.
Hey, Mark. First of all, thanks for having me. I got to say, loving the book, man. Wonderful.
Oh, thanks. Thank you.
And Scott, oh, sorry about that. It's my pleasure that I get to speak to you too. I have a couple quick questions for you, Scott. I'm sure your dad on the road loved going to Pittsburgh. Did he have a favorite city that he, man, I got to get back there. I have friends there. Or could you dwell on, a story or something about a favorite city that he might have visited?
Well, yeah, Pittsburgh really was his love. And he was actually, he knew Branch Rickey was going to trade him. But it still came hard to him to leave Pittsburgh. was so loved there. And when Branch Rickey traded him, the fans started to boycott the team, and they basically hung Branch Rickey in effigy. But my dad loved Pittsburgh so much. But I would say his second love was really New York. He really loved New York, and I think my dad he had an affinity to fine restaurants, and New York and has always he was a big uh, patron of Toots Shorts and 21. And he really, I would say New York would have been New York and Pittsburgh were his two favorites. Later on, probably Los Angeles after the Dodgers moved out to the West Coast because he was from Alhambra. So I would say that would be his locations that he probably enjoyed the most.
And now for you, I wanted to ask you, as a kid, did you live in New York or Jersey growing up as a kid?
I did. In 1962, when the Mets came into the league, my mom, my dad would leave for spring training in February, and we would stay in school until school was out. And my mom would drive us cross country. And when we first moved to New York, I spent every summer in 62 through 68. I spent every summer in New York, and at first in the city, and then we lived in Pelham. We would rent a house in Pelham, and one of the houses we rented, my mark might still be on that house because my brother and I wanted to participate in Banner Day, and my mom gave us a white sheet and some magic markers, and we went upstairs and we made our banner, "Let's Go Mets," with those magic markers. And when we lift up the sheet, it was still in the rug. It went right through the sheet into the rug of the carpet. So there's a rental in Pelham where the second floor it says "Let's Go Mets."
And
The
if they
reason
only
I asked,
if they only knew who did that, wow! Can you imagine if they knew who did that?
Scott, the only reason I asked that question is, growing up, did your friends know who your dad was, and like, were they Met fans, and like, did they go to Met games with you at all, or in school?
That's a great question. Of course, I went to school on the West Coast, and nobody that I went to school with on the West Coast really knew who my father was. My peers that when I was a kid, they didn't know who Ralph Kiner was, and so I didn't. It wasn't not that I. To me, it was not that big of a deal, and I didn't really recognize it until later in life. But when I was living in Pelham, and at the Pelham Country Club on the Pelham swim team in the summer, yeah, I used to take those guys. We'd all go to the game. My dad would load up the station wagon. We'd all go to Shea together, and it's a completely different story. I mean, in New York, jokingly used to say I could cash a check without ID, but in California, because even when my dad was playing, there wasn't a team. St. Louis was the only team on the other side of the Mississippi. So as an athlete and as a broadcaster, people on the West Coast had very little idea who my father was compared to people in New York.
Gotcha. Thank you. Thanks for answering that. If I could ask one more real quick, if you don't
Sure,
mind.
go ahead.
Dave Kingman's he's one of my top guys, top Mets. Were you around him? He had a reputation of being surly and stuff like that. How was he as a person, if you even know?
I wasn't personally I've met him on a few occasions, and his reputation certainly is that he was surly, and certainly he certainly had a falling out with the Mets management that resulted in him being traded. But there are a lot of surly baseball players. So
yes, sir. Hey man, thanks. I appreciate you answering that for me, Scott.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, pal.
we didn't touch on this, and you and I talked about this a little bit a couple of days ago. I know there's like a book or it's the saying like all I really needed to know I learned in kindergarten, and I changed that like all I really needed to know I learned from Murphy, Kiner, and Nelson. We didn't touch on their relationship. What was their relationship? What was your dad's relationship with Bob Murphy and Lindsey Nelson like?
He had a different relationship. My dad and Bob were very close, and to give you my Lindsey was kind of off to himself. I mean, they all got along. Don't get me wrong; they worked together for 17 years. But my dad was a lot closer to Bob. I relate a story to you that my dad and Bob went to a game. They drove to Shea, and it wasn't Shea. It might have been in spring training. They drove to the park in spring training, and of course, everybody wanted to get my dad's autograph. Very few people knew who Bob was. So whenever they would go someplace together, people would ask my dad for his autograph, and not necessarily Bob. So they get to the parking lot and they get out of the car, and this lady runs up to Bob, and she says, "Can I have your autograph?" And Bob's like, "Oh yeah, sure, I'd be happy to give it to you." And so she says, "Here, sign right here." And he signed the document before realizing he had just signed a summons to appear in court. And as the lady walked away, she said to Bob, she said, "By the way, I always thought you were a great broadcaster. Good luck in court." But that's the my dad's relationship with Bob was very, very much more personal. As a kid growing up, I remember in the summertime we go to Bob's house for barbecues. He had two daughters, I believe, and one was named Casey too. But to give you to give some perspective, my dad didn't find out from Lindsey that he was leaving the Mets. He found out from somebody else, and that he was going to the Giants to broadcast the Giants game, because Lindsey had it with. He just saw the writing on the wall that the Mets were at that particular juncture, which was at the end of the '86 season, or at the end of the '78 season, '79 season, something like that. He saw that the Mets had nobody in the farm system, and the ownership of the team wasn't making any plays to make the team better, and he decided he was going to go do something else. But of course, Lindsey was the dean of the trio because he had much more national exposure, and he was known as you may recall, he did so many bowl games on New Year's Day. He was called Mr. New Year's Day. And because he did PGA golf on network. He did a lot of other sports. He really was a great broadcaster, and his Tennessee accent there really made it even more fun to listen to him call the game. And he was a meticulous keeper of his scorecards, and he was he really was a pro. He was a super pro, Lindsey, and he was the dean of the three. And my dad looked up to him, but always felt that he never really knew him.
Interesting. Mike, I think you're waving your hand. I believe so. So we'll unmute Michael Tuller. Go ahead, Michael.
Thanks, Mark. You can't let people ask more than one question because Damon stole question number one. You stole question number two. So I have to go to my fallback number three. But first of all, I just wanted to show you that I picked up one year from Steiner Sports, which
That's
is
awesome.
Playing, and that's one of my prized possessions that I have hung on my wall. What I really wanted to ask was, did your dad ever take you on the road with him? And if he did, do you have a favorite story from the road or a favorite city?
You couldn't ask a better question. My dad took me on the road. It was a father-son road trip with the Mets. The road trip was Cincinnati-Pittsburgh, and the purpose of the trip was to take me back to Forbes Field so my dad could show me his stomping grounds. So we go to Cincinnati first. We didn't fly with the team, but we stayed in the team hotel, and we traveled on the bus with the team. And we were in Cincinnati, and Dad took me to his favorite restaurant, La Maisonette in Cincinnati. It's not there today. It was a great restaurant. And after lunch, before we went to the game, he said, I have to stop at Woolworths for a minute And so we went to Woolworths, and he bought some glasses. And I'm like, Dad, you don't need glasses. And I'm thinking to myself, my hero needs glasses. I said, it's not possible that Superman needs glasses. It's not possible that you need glasses. He said to me, I said, Dad, you don't need glasses. He said, Scott, they're not really glasses. They're cheaters. I need them to read. They help me read. And I said, okay, if that's the case. So that was one of the, I'll never forget the day that my dad needed glasses. But then Superman took me to Pittsburgh, and we get to Pittsburgh, and we get to Forbes Field about 2 hours before the game, which is typical of my father. He always got to every game 2 hours in advance. And we're walking through the stadium. He's showing me the ballpark, and this concessionaire comes up to shake his hand. And this concessionaire is older than my father, and he looks at me and he says, son, when I was your age, I used to watch your father hit him over the wall here at Forbes Field. My dad looks at me and he has that look like, you understand that's not possible. And I just say, I don't say anything. I just say, thank you very much to the gentleman. But I'll never forget my dad looking at me like, that's not possible. But while I was there in Pittsburgh, we had a great time. And I actually saw Willie Stargell hit a home run over the right field, over the roof of the right field at Forbes Field, which was rarely done. But I had another trip with him to San Francisco at another time. But I always loved the few times that I really got to travel with my dad without my brother and sister, just myself. And we really bonded on that. And obviously, it's a fond memory.
Thank you.
Awesome. Right. We got Matt. Matt, go ahead. Matt, part of the KINER'S staff. How you doing, Matt?
I'm unmuted and everything. Okay,
yes,
great.
you are.
Well, as Michael said, everyone took all the questions I had, but I did have a story about what a great guy that Ralph was, and I had my first book. They had, because he had written Baseball Forever with Triumph Publishing, they got him to do a signing before a Mets game at some Barnes and Noble on Long Island. So they got a car to take him out there, but from Greenwich Country Club, he was living there, and the guy got totally lost. And I'm sitting there, we got like a tie on. Everybody thinks that I work for Barnes and Noble, or I have some, we have no idea where he is or whatever. And they're starting to get really angry. And I've never had a book signing that had like more than 10 people. There's like 100 people, and you know how New York people can be. It's like, hey, what the heck? I have anything to do with it. And suddenly he shows up, and everybody just starts cheering and jumping up and down, and they forgot that there was ever any kind of a problem. And in like 20 minutes, we're sitting there next to each other. And people don't want my signature at all. He's like, yeah, make sure you get his signature on this book. He's the one that wrote it and all this other stuff, and couldn't have been nicer. And sat down for like a long interview that I'm hoping that I think we're gonna run again in the next few weeks. And but he was just great. One of the nicest people I've ever met in baseball, or really anybody else. And plus, he taught me everything I knew about baseball. And so that was one of my great thrills. And I still don't know if got many people at a signing that was just me. Other than that.
It'd be difficult to draw.
I really love that.
I'm sure you've
book.
gotten other stories like that too, because he was such a mensch.
Yes.
I was in Long Island when he was doing a signing, and the line was more than 100. And he was there for 2 hours. And in this particular instance, he was like 88 years of age, and he was signing away. And but that book is a great book, and I'll never forget. Right in 2004, when it came out, my dad asked me. My dad's wife at the time was very sick with cancer, and George Bush, President Bush, had invited the Hall of Famers to the White House for lunch, and I took Dad from the desert to the White House, and he gave George Bush a autographed copy of that book. But I was sitting in the bus to go to the White House, and I had the book in my hand, and Robin Roberts was right across from me, and he saw I had the book, and he said to me, he said, "Scott, I read your dad's book, and he's the only person that really got the story right." And what he was referring to was the the first time the players organized to get a pension plan from the owners way before they organized as a union. And my dad had been the National League representative, and Allie Reynolds from the Yankees had been the American League representative. And that story is told in that book, but that was what Robin Roberts was referring to, was that what really happened, that something my dad has never really been credited with, was the how he helped get, because he felt sorry. He was the highest paid player in the National League. He felt bad about how little the other players on the team were making. And people like, and I don't mean this in a derogatory manner, it's going to sound like it. I think a New York sports writer referred to Branch Rickey as El Cheapo. The owners, they weren't going to pay. And someone once said, Rickey had all the players and all the money, but he never let the two meet. Players were making so little money. My dad felt so bad that he did everything he could to try to make things better. And it started with that pension plan. And from there, it evolved into Marvin Miller coming along. And my dad said Marvin Miller was the guy who really made everything happen. And it's a wonderful thing. It's a wonderful story. But at one point in time, baseball players were the most underpaid players or workers in the country. And today they're maybe the most overpaid. Who's to say?
Interesting. One of my favorite memories, and I've met him many, many times, but the bat dinner. You see the background behind me. This, to me, this is the KINER'S Corner. I know there were many different KINER'S Corner sets, but this is the one that's just totally ingrained in my head. And they had a repro of it at the bat dinner, and your dad was sitting behind there, and people could go and talk to him. And I have a picture of your dad shaking my hand in front of that, and it's like my moment on KINER'S Corner. It was like something I cherish tremendously, and I love that background. Sal, you had your hand up. Sal is our resident. I think maybe Michael might have stolen your thunder though, Sal, because Sal always has, no matter who we have on, he's got some sort of memorabilia. We had Doug Flynn on once, and he had the New York City subway placard of Doug Flynn, which was absolutely amazing. But Sal, what do you got for us today?
Well, I actually saw Sal reaching for something and knew I had him before him.
Well, this is his rookie card, 1940 Bowman.
No.
It took me a long time to get this because Ralph's popularity here makes it hard to get your hands on things like this. But that's part of the 48.
I've never seen it.
And then this one here is one of my favorites.
Oh, here we go.
Now, unfortunately, he's with the Indians, but in 1950 clear, autographed by Ralph.
Nice. All right. Sal never disappoints. What's your question, Sal?
You guys all asked my question, so next week I'm going to go first, and then I'm just going to take care of it. Scott, it's a pleasure to meet you. Back in the day, they broadcast radio and TV. They bounce back and forth. Did Ralph have a preference, or was there anything that made it difficult, like once he went to the radio side? Do you have any stories about how he did as a broadcaster?
Well, when he was in the Pacific Coast League as a general manager of the Padres, I mean, he ran the team, and he negotiated contracts for the Padres to actually do TV broadcasts in San Diego, and he didn't have any money to hire a broadcaster, so he did it himself. And he never really considered that to be broadcasting. But in that particular time, to try to sell tickets to the Padres, he started doing recreations. If you remember recreations, you don't look old enough to remember recreations. I don't even remember them. So, but yeah, there you go. But he probably had a love for radio, because when he went to Chicago to do the White Sox before going to the Mets, he had to do a recreation every Saturday their flagship station that they were on. But I think that in the end, I would say that he much preferred to be in on camera, and I don't think I think he kind of felt that maybe, I don't know, it's hard to say. Bob was so great at radio. He had such a fantastic voice. And my dad, I don't know, it's look here, that's his PR picture. I mean, he probably thought he'd get more endorsements if he was on TV than on radio. I don't know, but I do remember in the early days they do 3 innings and then rotate, and then it wasn't until, I don't know, maybe 10 years or more into the Met existence that they designated Bob for radio and my dad only did TV.
It was a good move, I'll tell you.
Yeah, it was unbelievable.
We talked about, Ralph's quote unquote mistakes, their folklore here. But the thing that really got Ralph's memory was amazing. He would come out with stories from when he played, and this is like 20, 30 years earlier, and spot on with every detail. I mean, is that he was at home too?
Yeah, my dad was just a wonderful person. He had a great sense of humor, but he also had a great memory, and he had a way of finding humor in the stories. It's like the time, someone threatened to kill him as a ball player, and the FBI got involved, and he would tell this story, and he could tell it better than anybody about how he was supposed to be shot on the field during a doubleheader, and in Pittsburgh. And the guy who had asked for ransom money to get paid off. Anyway, my dad said, it was during the 4th of July weekend, and my dad said, I'll tell you the whole story, but my dad said, if someone shoots off a firecracker, all you're going to see in left field is a pair of shoes. So he tells the story of how when the game was over, and he wasn't shot, obviously, and he came off the field, and the center fielder, George Mekovich, said, "I'm sure glad this game is over." And my dad said to George, he said, "George, that's really kind of you to think of me like that." He said, "Think of you? I was thinking about myself." And my dad said, "Why?" And George said, "What's your number, Ralph?" He said, 4. And Mekovich said, "What's my number?" He said, my dad says, 44. And Mekovich says, "What if the guy had double vision?" I mean, those are some of the stories that he would relate in his broadcasting, and many, 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 many others that made actually the strength of his announcing was his storytelling, and being able to weave that into the broadcast to the entertainment, particularly if it was a bad game or a slow game. You still have to be an entertainer, and particularly if you're a funny entertainer, that makes it even better. And he knew that, and that's what made him who he was.
Beautiful. Thanks, Scott.
So, Scott, thank you so much for your time tonight. It's this has been the journey with the KINER'S Corner book, and then the website and the Facebook community has just been something special for me. And then and we really try to keep it so respectful and dignified, the fan page as well. And when you joined it made me raise the bar even higher, knowing that Ralph's son is in that group, and we're proud of what we do, but it's something special considering that you're in that group and you interact, and it means so much to me for you doing this tonight. I really appreciate it, as do the people here tonight and the people that will be watching this afterwards. So I really appreciate your time tonight and being part of our group.
It's my honor. Happy to do it.
Thank you. Everyone's clapping. Love it.